So a very important concept that we talk about on our IKN courses is this concept of the stress timeline. And when we speak about stress, remember, we're not looking at stress as a negative thing. We're looking at stress as anything that loads our system. So remember we said in the prior segment that your manual therapy, your loading approaches, your exercise-based approaches, stretching, it all loads the system, it all stresses the system, because stress is anything that requires or encourages your system to respond to something. Stress is anything that encourages your system to expend energy to respond to something. So many of the things that we do as healthcare and rehab practitioners all comes back to how we stress the system. But the key is understanding where we deliver our stress. Where does the individual need more stress? Where does the individual need less stress? If we can identify those areas, those layers where the individual needs more or less stress, then we can allow the individual to express more pain-free movement, more efficient movement. But it all comes back to having a simple framework to assess and to address these issues. But when it comes to the stress timeline, what we need to understand is that when you come into the world as a child, it's very important to understand the neural development of our movements, to understand how stress impacts the system. And so what we're going to use is we're going to use a very, very simple visual graphic here where we have stress on this end and time on this end. And what we have at the top here would be the stress threshold, we can say. So right here you can look at this as your stress or your protective threshold. So once stress surpasses this threshold here, that's when your body might feel the need to express pain. But if we step back and understand what happens when a child comes into the world, when a child comes into the world, they have to engage with a lot of stress that they haven't engaged with in a long time or ever. Because when you're a baby, you're essentially living in an aquatic environment where you're not really dealing with any kind of major stress. But when you come out of the womb for the first time, you're dealing with gravity, you're dealing with loud sounds, you're dealing with trying to look for food yourself. So all these things have an influence on the amount of stress acting on your body. So when you come into the real world, your stress goes whoop, straight up. But as long as you don't have any kind of condition that hampers your ability to relax, typically your stress can come back down. So you can reset back down to baseline. Now, as you move throughout life, you might get stressed, then the stress is gone, and then you might reset back down towards baseline. But as you get older and as we start dealing with more and more stress, once we get stressed, we try to reset back down to baseline, but then we get stressed again. We try to reset back down to baseline, but then we get stressed again. And all of a sudden, we're living at this layer here, where we're very, very far away from baseline and we're very close to the stress or protective threshold. So this area here, this space between the protective threshold and the activity of our body or the stress capacity of our body would be a reflection of our robustness. So this is ultimately how much stress that we can take before we tip over the edge and our nervous system feels the need to express pain. So if, for example, we have somebody with back pain, and let's say they are here, they're above that protective threshold, they're in a state of stress where they're overstressed, overloaded, so the nervous system feels the need to express pain. So what we need to do is we need to understand, what do we need to help this individual do to bring them back down below as far as we possibly can towards baseline, so that we can make them more robust where the nervous system doesn't feel the need to express pain. That is the key. We're trying to create an environment where the individual doesn't feel the need to express pain. Their nervous system doesn't feel the need to express pain. That's incredibly important, because let's say, for example, with this individual, you give them a stretch. Okay, and that stretch allows them to come down below the threshold just to about here. But the key with this is that they're still very, very close to that protective threshold. So then could walk out of the clinic and all of a sudden they get stressed again and the pain will tip them back over the edge and they're back where they were. So what we need to do as practitioners is we need to understand the basic principles that govern our movement, that allow us to handle stress. Because if we can merge a stretch, let's say for example with back pain, if we can merge a stretch of the hip, for example, with how that hip operates with the rest of the lower limb to make the whole lower limb and lower back very robust, very protective, so the nervous system feels like it can handle stress, then we can bring you back down as far as we comfortably can towards baseline, so we can open up a lot more room for robust movement. So it all comes back to how well you can handle stress. But we need to look at the muscles, the nerves and the joints through a very specific lens to improve your overall robustness. Okay? Because in the same way, we could have two people with back pain. Back pain person 1 is here. Back pain person 2 is higher up here. Okay? Now, if I give this individual here, back pain person 1, a piriformis stretch, or a simple stretch for example, and it brings them back down below the protective threshold, but I give the same kind of stretch to this person, but it only brings them down to here, just to the point where they're just above the protective threshold, then that doesn't necessarily have an influence on their pain experience. It doesn't mean that it did not help them, but what it means is that we need to add more layers to their loading strategies, to our treatment and our rehab approach. And if we can understand the fundamental properties that govern our movement, which we'll talk about in the next few segments, then we can have an influence and a framework to influence the body in every single client that we see, using a very, very simple model. Because really, when you look at movement of an individual, we all move in different ways, but beneath the surface, we all have very similar mechanisms that govern our movement. So what we are sharing with you, or what we want to share with you in our courses, is a very simple framework to merge those local strategies, those local techniques with more global strategies, so you can have more of an influence over an individual's pain experience and their movement experience, to make them as robust as possible, bringing them back down to the baseline so they can take more stress before they tip over that protective threshold and express pain. We're trying to get them from here to as far down below that protective threshold towards baseline as possible, and keep them there. If we can keep them there, then we can ultimately have a much longer term influence over their pain and their movement experiences.